So basically, oil and gas supplies are getting throttled. Nearly 140 ships used to pass a day per day through the Strait of Hormuz before the conflict began, and now it's almost down to a trickle, or perhaps on some days no ship passes.
Huge shortage of jet fuel. Huge.
Yes. So we might see ticket prices being raised. You'll see air travel becoming dearer across the world, not merely in the Gulf.
Maybe I'll have to come by ship to India next. You've been predicting the rupee would drop for a while. I've been even more negative and pessimistic than you. I expected the rupee to go well beyond 100 to a dollar, and the currency crisis could lead to a balance of payments crisis. India would be hard pressed to avoid what people are calling
pressures would definitely be very
frill. Let me just say what a number of people are saying: a frill, fertilizer, food, and foreign exchange crisis, combined with, of course, job losses, particularly amongst the middle class and falling incomes.
So when it comes to Europe, I think the bigger issue for them is the complete exhaustion, or I would say the spending of political capital.
Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Manu Sharma again. He's a partner at FOI. He is one of the top geopolitical analysts from India. He lives in India. He has been an investor. He has been an economist. He has been a pollster or psephologist, as you'd say if you wanted to use a fancier word. Today, we are going to discuss something a bit disconcerting for most of our viewers and listeners. We are going to examine the economic implications of the Iran war. Welcome, Manu.
It's a pleasure.
So, Manu, what are the immediate? We'll have this conversation. We'll discuss the immediate implications, the medium term, and the long term, and we'll also look at how this war affects different regions. So we have a lot of ground to cover. So, without further ado, paint us a picture of the immediate impact of this war.
So, the canvas of implications as of now is divided into two sectors, as you called it. There are generic implications, which are intertemporal, divided across times. So you have the short term, your medium term, and the long one.
Yeah.
But then you also have various geographies or regions, economic regions rather, reacting differently to whatever is going to be.
So basically, the time and space axis. You're almost sounding like Einstein.
Yeah, well, in the grand scheme of things, I guess most of the things tend to converge, and we are seeing this grand convergence because of this war, which I mean, it started off as a regional conflict, but is manifesting itself into something very global and universal in nature. So, beginning, with the short-term implications. Now,
the immediate.
Yeah. So basically, let's say within 6 months, what happens? We are seeing some of it actually now. So the first is throttling of the oil and gas supplies from the Gulf. I mean, this is
and fertilizers too.
That I'll talk.
Yeah.
That I'll talk. So basically, oil and gas supplies are getting throttled. Nearly 140 ships used to pass a day per day through the Strait of Hormuz before the conflict began, and now it's almost down to a trickle, or perhaps on some days no ship passes.
Yeah.
And now this is very critical for things like diesel, petrol, crude oil, and also jet fuel, because this is a very interesting thing that seabound commerce is impacting the air travel. So how now we see a convergence between water and air too.
Huge shortage of jet fuel. Huge.
Yes. So we might see ticket prices being raised. You'll see air travel becoming dearer across the world, not merely in the Gulf.
Maybe I'll have to come by ship to India next.
And yeah, good old days. I mean, yeah, take a jolly good trip around the world like Magellan and discover the world that way. Uh, yeah, we might all be doing that soon if this continues. But um, then, there's this question of the important side products or the byproducts of oil production, which include sulfur, asphalt, lubricants, plastics, and other derivative chemicals. And these are very critical not only for industrial activity, but also remember um, the entire edifice of modern medicine stands on the hydrocarbon industry and the chemicals derived from there. So if this disruption goes on for longer, we would actually see medical costs rising and significant disruptions in availability of certain chemicals which are critical for production of medicines. So that's in short the short term implication whereby you have energy and critical inputs for industrial activity becoming scarce or becoming uh, very expensive. Then, what happens if this really continues or it enters into a sort of stalemate that just persists? Then you would have the feeder products basically impacting the downstream products. Now that sounds jargon, but in simple terms, for example, if you have fertilizer shortage, you will start seeing food shortages or agricultural produce shortages within a year because then you would run out of the stocks of existing fertilizers and other chemicals needed for
In,
agriculture.
in, in the northern hemisphere, it is spring planting season.
Yes, yes,
And, and this spring planting season will occur without enough inputs of fertilizers. And so, to put
yes,
it simply, if you do not have fertilizers at this time, then fast forward a few months, when harvest time appears, the yields will be lesser. Modern agriculture
yes, yes,
depends on
precisely.
inputs of fuel and fertilizers.
Yes. So what we will see is basically uh, first the energy and the input products becoming dearer, but then
Mhm.
about a year down the line, you will see uh, basics, needed for human survival, like food becoming expensive and also
Mhm.
hard to find. Now,
Mhm.
this will manifest in one way in, let's say, the food production belts. Like so, for example, America is pretty well, I would say, placed when it comes to
Insulated.
food
America
production.
is insulated because America has enough energy of its own. It's a
Yes, but when
continent.
it comes to, let's say, the petromonarchies in the Gulf, they
Mhm.
have to import food on daily basis. So they
Correct.
will face massive pressure from the local population and also the migrants or expatriates, as they're called,
Mhm.
if they are from a rich country, to produce or to get food on the table. Now, this would lead to uh, ramifications like the governments generating extra funding by drawing down their investments in US and Europe by trying to invest in local production, even if at a higher cost, because they would deem this as a strategic necessity. So even if the agricultural um, initiative is economically prohibitive, they would still undertake it because they would be hard placed to get the supplies from anywhere else in the world. So what we are looking at is a crisis in which countries would be forced to take decisions which would economically would not be deemed rational. You know,
Mm.
if one were to think of in terms of theory of economics, they would be termed irrational actors. But then uh, they'll have to do it because of the
Mm.
pressures involved. Now
I mean,
that
look, our senior partner, FOI senior partner, Glenn Carl, and I have always said revolutions depend on the price of bread. or if you're in East Asia, on the price of rice. And the specter of Arab uprisings 2.2 is already coming to the fore, and not a lot of monarchies, petro monarchies, are worried about it simply because fresh food, for instance, has to come in pretty quickly. The Gulf is a pretty hot place, and it'll get hotter in terms of weather as we go from spring to summer. So food is scarce now, but as harvests fail or fail to yield as high a crop as earlier, you will see shortages, food prices rising, and ensuing political instability. And governments will try everything. They will throw the kitchen sink to avoid that specter.
Yes.
Over to you. So, what comes next?
So this is basically the state of affairs when it comes to the region itself where the war is ongoing. But other than this, when we talk about the wider Asian circuit or other countries in Africa or in Latin America, we would also see implications over there, which would basically be about destruction of um, stock prices. We would also see interest rate flare ups
So,
because
are we
the
talking
debt
the medium
servicing.
term? We are talking still about the medium term.
Correct. We are still in the medium term,
Yeah.
and we would also see perhaps we would also see a flight to safety towards hard assets amongst the investors, because what would happen is that the confidence in the resilience of economic activity, which basically is reflected through equities. Equity is just buying into a share of economic activity of a firm or an economy.
It's a bet on the
um,
future in many ways.
Future and also
Yeah.
current, and
Yeah,
also
and
the
current, and yeah,
present.
of course, balance sheets and future cash flows and future P&L,
and
profit and loss.
and should there be significant doubts about that, I think then people would withdraw money, and and there would be a flight to safety towards hard assets like precious metals or even agricultural land in some of the countries where it's fruitful to do so. So overall, in medium term, we would see a realignment of how the world works. A lot of decisions that currently seem impossible would start looking feasible, and we may see a complete upturning of the current economic and trade flows, particularly from the perspective of agriculture and from the perspective of safe haven investing. These are two important
Got it.
things to watch out for in the medium term:
Got
agriculture and safe haven investing. These two terms will get redefined if this
safe haven,
conflict.
meaning people start buying gold and platinum and silver and copper and commodities. Um,
Things with lower counterparty risk, that is, you know basically the asset ownership is between you and the asset, and not with somebody else guaranteeing that
mm,
ownership, or there being some other kind of intermediary in the
mm,
economic chain that would reflect basically a low trust economy or low trust regime when it comes to economic decision making, which
mhm.
is, it seems it seems that this will be in the offing if the conflict persists in the medium term. Now, what happens in the long term? Let's say 5 years down the line, what would the world look like if this conflict were to play out in its entirety? And we see and when we say entirety, basically, we see a complete and utter scorched earth tactic being played out in the entire Gulf, wide scale destruction of infrastructure, and long-term capital investments. Now, there's a very high risk
I
of
mean, by scorched earth, you mean Iran hits desalination plants and perhaps
not
Israel just,
only not only of the Gulf petromonarchies, but also Israeli ones.
yeah,
So the infrastructure destruction won't just be limited to Persian Gulf, but actually uh, everywhere. That would basically reflect in
mm,
a stagflation. You know, you'll have a global uh, crisis whereby a significant proportion of energy production gets taken offline because of
mhm,
destruction of the infrastructure of production,
mhm,
which triggers sustained high energy prices.
mhm,
And because the input costs become higher, you know, it's a rather simple one-to-one mapping that when the input costs become higher, it becomes tougher to produce more. So
yeah,
you have output cut or GDP cut, as
mhm,
they are called now. So you have a decline in the output. And that decline in the output would basically lead to the phenomena of what's called stagflation or stagnant economy plus inflation. So
stagnation
you
plus inflation, which we saw back in the 1970s,
19,
and lest we forget, 1973, the first bout of stagflationary economics was triggered by Iran as well. That was
yeah. And
OPEC actually, but of course Iran was a key player, and that was after the Yom Kippur War,
yes,
in reaction to Israel fighting, or it was Syria and Egypt who invaded Israel then, and of course Israel prevailed, and we saw the OPEC embargo, and that led to stagflation in Western economies. And in 1979, there was another bout. So lest we forget that this is the third time Iran is triggering stagflationary pressures. This is not the first.
yeah. So then what follows is basically now, here's the interesting thing that if we assume that there is a wide scale destruction of infrastructure,
Mm-hmm.
that by implication means that US and Israel, who've initiated the conflict for now, would be unable to defend the Gulf countries and their economy. Now, what that is outside of the purview of the financial architecture, because if you cannot defend them, then they would see less and less incentive to be a part of your financial architecture or the currency architecture. So that will have some implications for the dollar, because you might see other countries step in and say that, look, well, you were not very well protected by your previous patrons, but give us a chance. Maybe we can do better, and let's have a different currency
Or even
architecture.
simpler, Manu, the petrodollar contract, which is an informal contract, could come into question. What is initially, of course, we had FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, make a deal with Ibn Saud. And what was this deal? And people forget there was a massive rivalry between the US and the UK for hegemony in Saudi Arabia and control of oil. So, very simply, what happens? We get we get Roosevelt guaranteeing the security of the Gulf monarchies and the Gulf promising oil. Over a period of time, America has become self reliant in energy. So now it is really not oil from the Gulf, but the fact that oil and gas from the Gulf are priced in dollars, which leads to the petrodollar phenomenon. So if you are, say, Taiwan or China, or maybe not China, but certainly South Korea and Japan, you have to buy dollars and then give those dollars to Qatar or Kuwait or whoever you're buying your oil from. And then this dollar that comes into these Gulf states is invested and plowed into Western financial markets. And this allows America to have cheaper debt than anyone, American consumers to have lower rates on their credit cards, buy cheaper stuff in Walmart, and so on and so forth. This is what Valerie Detang Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the French former French president, called the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. So what you're really saying is that this could be up for question. Maybe now the Europeans could say, let's just price the gas we are buying from you, Qatar, in euros. Maybe the Japanese could tell, well, maybe let's just do it in yen, because then everyone would be saving a little bit, and or if not saving a little bit, at least avoiding exposure to the dollar. So even before the security guarantee, they may become a little footloose and fancy over time in the long run. Is that what you envisage?
See, when it comes to petrodollar, it is fundamentally security plus financial architecture. It's
Mm-hmm.
not in isolation. It's not merely the dollar offers the best of the currency terms and the least transaction charges, and that's why everybody uses this. No, there is a strong element of security, and that security element got validated during the invasion of Kuwait
In
by Saddam
1991,
Hussein.
the Gulf War,
Yes,
George Bush Sr.
yes, yes. So US did come and protect its ally and basically ensured their freedom. So,
And
so
also, we must remind our viewers and listeners that in the 1980 to 1988 Iran-Iraq War, the U.S. Navy escorted ships through the Strait of Hormuz. That is
yes, they
also
did.
true.
Yes, and that uh, and that element is very important when we discuss petrodollar. That it's not merely about providing the best terms or the best currency out there. Yes, dollar may be the best currency in the world, but still you need to provide security. Otherwise, that's not the complete deal, and the petromonarchies are really looking for more. So, if there is indeed widespread devastation of infrastructure, then that architecture comes under strain. I'm not saying that it will be unwinded fully, but yes, there will be significant questions around it by the regional governments and also the businesses. So that's one element. Another element of this is, and which is sort of interlinked, is that um, Gulf countries have this social contract of the royal houses running a welfare state, a fairly good welfare state,
Very
based on the
generous in
surplus.
certain
Yes,
countries. I mean, we just did a
yes,
very long discussion on the Kuwaiti universal basic income, and
yeah,
I was just blown away by the quantum,
yeah.
the generosity of support they offer their citizens.
So, so here's the thing that because they have that social contract of countries providing generous welfare benefits out of the surplus generated from the hydrocarbon industry,
Mhm.
people will continue expecting that even if the infrastructure is gone. Now, the countries would be hard put to balance their budgets if they don't have ongoing cash flow. So basically, if you can't draw the oil out and ship it off,
Mhm.
uh, you don't earn. And if you don't earn, your budget is not balanced. And if it's not balanced, you have to finance the deficit. Where do you finance the deficit from? That's the question. And this is where it could get problematic for certain states to keep the gravy train going. And that will be a very big question in the long term, not for
In
now.
the not in the short term. So
Yeah,
you could see these petro monarchies. I mean, the cliche goes that the Arab palace and the Arab street are not on the same page, especially
same
when it
thing.
comes to Israel. And with this war, the gulf in the Persian Gulf between the Arab palace and the Arab street is only going to get wider and deeper. And the big fear of many of my friends in the security realm who analyze geopolitics, analyze foreign policy, are experts in internet, or you know, expert is a big word, but are are knowledgeable about international affairs is the very stability of these monarchies. As one of them said, the US and Israel wanted regime change in Iran. They might very well get regime change in Bahrain. Be careful of what you wish for. And of course, the reason they picked out Bahrain is because it's a Sunni royal family ruling over a largely Shia population, and there is history in the Arab uprisings. The Bahrainis were able to quell mass protests by getting help from the Saudis and, of course, also Pakistanis. And one of the things that has scared people is when the Iranian missiles were hitting Bahraini bases, some of the people recording those videos were cheering the hits on. And so the Gulf is not exactly extremely stable. And with the large immigrant population, and the immigrant population that has come does not have skin in the game to the same degree. There's no pathway to citizenship. There's, yes, certain countries give a fair bit of economic liberty and some certainty when it comes to law and precedent, all of that. But at the end of the day, they are outsiders, and none other than Joseph Olmert, our dear friend, who is from a very eminent Israeli background. And indeed, his brother was prime minister. His grandfather signed the Declaration of Independence, and he himself has had an illustrious career. He said that this is simply not sustainable. So this is on the radar of astute observers and analysts of the region, Manu. So do you expect these petro-monarchies to finally fall, or some of them to?
See, I think that's where all of these countries and entities cannot be clubbed together.
Indeed, it's a
There
fair
is,
point.
yeah, there is a very vast spectrum, that
Yeah.
these countries cover in terms of how modern, how diversified in terms of economy, and
Mm,
how progressive they are. Now, if I
mm,
were to put my money on that, which of these would be the most adaptive, I can forthrightly say that UAE would
mm,
fare much better. They would do actually very well because whenever there's been a crisis, they've done very well,
mm.
partly because they realized the importance of diversification of the economy
Yeah.
way before than any other country in the Gulf did, and they have a very
No, I
progressive.
mentioned that when I was a corporate lawyer in London, Dubai was planning to be a financial center and working
Yes,
hard at it and hiring
yes,
some of the best minds in the city of London to help them achieve their goal. So they,
yeah,
they, they were seeing around the corner well before other
indeed.
counterparts did.
So UAE is expected to do really well, in the long term. But there may be significant doubts, for example, around Bahrain, which
Hmm.
has a
And
fairly complicated
there are,
it has a fairly
yeah.
complicated political tapestry, and also, it's suffered a lot of damage
Hmm.
in the current war.
Hmm.
So there is this spectrum, across
Hmm.
which these countries are distributed, and what eventually happens to them would be also a factor of the various circumstances and the policy choices that they
Hmm.
undertake.
Hmm.
So, dependent on contingent on those choices, we will see different outcomes.
Yeah.
But overall, the pressures, yes, the pressures will be similar, but the outcomes would be differing because of the policy choices and the leadership involved. So
I
that's
mean,
in a nutshell as to what would happen
got it.
politically speaking.
Got it. And of course, you haven't even talked about Iraq, which a lot of commentary, which has attracted a lot of attention, and a lot of people are predicting a polycrisis hitting Iraq. Is that in the long term? Do you think it's medium? Do you think it's even short? Similarly, Kuwait. I mean, these are not exactly. Uh, I mean, they are not next to Qatar, but they are also big, important or one of them is a big country and has history of the Iraq War. What happens there?
See, with Iraq, I think first there is the question of various ethnic enclaves
Mm,
within the country, how they behave. The Kurds have a mind of their own.
absolutely.
The Shia population is actually straining at the leash, and they're basically thinking of allying heavily with the current Iranian government.
I mean, look,
Uh,
the U.S. has ordered all Americans out of Iraq. The
yes,
U.S. embassy in
the
Baghdad.
So have the European countries.
Yeah.
Um, and then you have the Sunni
Sorry,
population.
just this bit of information for the viewers and listeners that the U.S. embassy in Baghdad, it was hit. Either Iran or Iranian-backed militias have hit it. So Iraq is in turmoil. Over to you, Manu.
Indeed. Now, the problem for Iraq is that although it's a country, it's described as a country, but it's not really cohesive as of now.
Mhm.
It has three major ethnic groups, and they don't seem to be on the same page when it
They
comes
don't
to
see eye to eye, of course, open secret.
yes. And dependent upon their sectarian allegiances, various regions of Iraq would behave differently. So for now, the prognosis for Iraq seems to be that it is headed towards, some sort of end state like Lebanon. Basically,
Mm,
you have an entity which is described as one, but effectively it behaves, or it acts through three different channels. And that is what I think the future would look like. The Kurds would behave differently. The Shias would
mm,
align closely to Iran, and the Sunnis would perhaps be
mhm,
more closely aligned to the Turks.
mhm,
Um, and that is what the end state looks like in
mhm.
Iraq. And this was
You're
eventually,
not talking like the Mossad.
well, fair enough.
This is very much the Israeli prediction.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, so fair enough. I mean, the at least I'm just a table chair desk analyst, so
An armchair analyst. Yeah.
so yeah, so that's fine. I guess the two opinions are perhaps converging, but the overall picture for Iraq was along this
Yeah.
course only. It's not that the
The
course
war
has
may hasten that end, but the
exact.
war hasn't changed anything
Yeah, it has
substantial. So
just
let's move
quickened the
on.
pace.
Since we've
Yeah,
moved on from the temporal to the spatial, from time to space, let's talk about the impacts, and let's move from the east to the west. What is the impact of this war on East Asia, the modern industrial powerhouse of the world? The factory of the world is China. The semiconductor factory or the producer of semiconductors of the world is Taiwan, and a lot of really high tech still comes from Japan, despite Japan not having that great growth for a few decades.
yeah. I mean, not
And
to
and
forget
and
Korea.
South Korea, I was coming to it, which is the shipbuilding capital of the world, and electronics too. So East Asia, very
And
much.
also I'll add the mid-level manufacturing is still a stronghold of the Southeast Asian economies.
Exactly. So
So overall,
let's club them together,
East,
East and
yeah.
Southeast Asia, the
So
manufacturing powerhouse of the world. What happens to these? Because they get a lot of their inputs from the Gulf.
precisely. So the economic engine of the world may be distributed across various capitals and economies for now, but the industrial engine of the
Mm,
world is firmly in the east and southeast, and that geography is heavily dependent upon the Gulf to feed its industries energy and raw materials. Now, one may say that, oh, wow, great. Uh, we feel that some economists and some politicians in the West also feel that China has excess capacity and they're dumping and they don't need actually to produce so much. So a little bit of output cut may not harm anyone. It's actually good for the world, good for everyone. Maybe
I
not
mean, look,
China.
I'll stop you there. There are even crazier theories here where I sit in Washington D.C. There are people who
Okay.
genuinely believe that
Mhm.
this war will raise the energy costs for China and East Asia, that this would then make them gradually uncompetitive, and this would bring back industry, reshoring would happen. America would rise as an industrial power again, and this war could and probably would make America great again. So there are all kinds of theories going around. In fact, there are senators and congressmen talking about this war giving over control of oil to America. They already now control Venezuelan oil. They have a gun to the head of Delcy Rodriguez, and if America was to acquire control over Iranian reserves, take over Karg Island, take over control of Iranian oil exports, then they could squeeze China, which still needs energy as an industrial superpower. Over to you. So, lots of theories, my dear friend.
So here's the thing, the problem with that sort of thinking is that an output cut in China or a capacity restriction or capacity reduction in East Asia and Southeast Asia, um, according to these kind of theorists, would immediately mean that that capacity shifts westwards and benefits the Western economies, primarily American one. That may eventually happen in very, very long term. I mean, I'm not disputing that anything is possible, but
Well, look,
for
America has cheap gas. America has cheap oil. America has
yes,
always has the energy advantage. And lest we forget, America was a manufacturing power.
but
Uh,
anything like that, see, but anything that like that would take decades. But
mhm,
before that, what will happen? Before that, uh, you will have capacity reduction leading to lesser availability of finished goods.
mhm.
So the cheap t-shirts, the cheap shoes, the cheap electronics,
Laptops and phones.
yes, electronics, the overall quality of life in the West is currently contingent upon extremely cheap industrial goods produced by East and Southeast Asia.
Mhm,
So, forgetting everything else, forget deficit financing, forget about quantitative easing, the inflation generated by all that, the inflation generated by energy,
mhm.
uh, just focusing on availability of industrial goods. If that gets reduced, it adds another dimension to inflation and negatively impacts the quality of life for everyone concerned, from
So, so,
billionaire.
so,
Mhm.
so no longer the same cheap goods you can order on Amazon or shop at
or,
Walmart. In a
or
nutshell,
I think what's the site? We don't have that in India. It begins with T. Um,
Timo.
yes, yes, we don't have that here. Yeah. So and see, and we'd love to have it, but privileges of America. And yeah, so amazing stuff you can buy for cheap, and all of that gets called into question eventually. Some would say that's good, like we should face some adversity and learn from it, and become stronger. Fair enough, but then you'll have to convince your populations for that and tell them that look, this is coming up, and we should be prepared. But the inflation generated by lack of goods would be a real thing, and it would be separate from the inflation generated by monetary policy choices and energy push.
I see. So, if I am to break this down very simply, industrial output gets throttled in East Asia. That leads to shortages of supply and consequent inflation at a time when energy prices are going up globally, at a time when you have already had a loose monetary policy for decades. First under you can argue Alan Greenspan, and then after the 2008 financial crisis, where you had quantitative easing. So basically, the balance sheets of the central banks are really high, and so you could very much end up with hyperinflation, not just inflation, from the way you paint this situation. Would that be fair to draw this conclusion?
Yeah.
Okay, so but what happens to East Asia? Okay, so much so that is you know, that what you're pointing out is the causal, link to the West. All right, uh, this is how the economic effects ricochet across space. What happens to East Asia as supply goes down? Because they have a social contract. They have followed that contract. And that is pretty much similar, whether it is Taiwan or China, whether it is South Korea or, say, Thailand. What happens to that social contract wherein people trade political liberty, or not necessarily political liberty, but let's say political volatility, the fractious politics elsewhere, because South Korea is actually quite a volatile political democracy now, for economic progress. But still, there's a social stability to it. People are not
Yes.
always going on strike. People are putting their head down and working. There is a social stability to East Asia. And, I'm a historian by training. And I've written a 13,000 word piece on India-China tensions and studied a lot of 19th century China. Forget 19th century China, even 20th century China until the 1970s was not exactly a peaceful place. The volatility in China was nuts. In fact, the greatest in the world.
Mm.
So what happens to
So,
that newfound
so
stability?
yeah.
50 years of it.
See, okay. Now, East Asia has had a very peculiar political past in that yes, there was colonialism, they were subject to imperialism, but their reaction to colonial rule was to uh, throw up pretty violent uh, anti-imperial political movements, be it China, be it even Indonesia, uh, be it even Malaysia. So what happened across these geographies was that um, when these countries came into being, they came into being under very turbulent circumstances. South Korea was literally generated out of a war. There was the big Korean War. Um,
1950 to 1953, and even today, that
the
conflict is
legacy
frozen.
continues.
Yeah, that's frozen
Yes,
across.
the legacy continues. So the governments that came to be in that region thought that there is already so much turmoil. How do you cool down the temperatures? You don't cool down temperatures by introducing political volatility by saying, oh, let's have multiple parties and all of them are at each other's throats. And before we know, they will say, nah, elections are too boring. Let's pick up guns.
Mhm.
And, and to avoid that sort of thing, they said, well, you know what, guys, let's have a single party rule. Some would call it communism, others would call it dictatorship, some other would call, I don't know, some other form of paternal despotism or whatnot. But largely, everyone promised one thing, that we will give you income growth, we will give you quality of life growth, and all you have to do is not be turbulent, not be volatile. And that's the social contract, and that has persisted. Why? because virtually every government, whether it was democratic, whether it was non-democratic, whether it was communist, I mean, this is very intriguing. All of them had different brand tags attached to them, but virtually uh, high income growth, it delivered capitalism, and it delivered very good quality of life, especially from the base, where they began from. And that has
Very
persisted.
quickly, I'll take a minute and point out that Kuomintang, KMT, and the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, were on two sides of the civil war. And in fact, the Kuomintang ended up in Taiwan after losing that civil war. And of course, now Taiwan is a democracy, but the Kuomintang, I have a 90-minute podcast with senior partner Glenn Carl on this, on Taiwan, which I encourage you to listen if you want to dive deep. The Kuomintang followed a very paternalistic, you could argue dictatorial, some would argue even fascistic state, certainly authoritarian, but they did deliver income growth, they did bring in industrialization, and eventually, of course, it led to democracy. And in a way, once you get Deng Xiaoping in 1978, and he says it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. And once you get the likes of Zhu Rongji, not as well known in the West, China emulates exactly the same model. So the CCP and the KMT in their economic policies, ironically, don't end up so far apart eventually. And both, to be fair to them, each of them deliver high growth. Now, of course, Taiwan is ruled by another party, DPP, and who knows, maybe China one day may be ruled by another party, though I'm not holding my breath. But the important thing is that both have delivered rising incomes and largely social stability. Over to you, Manu.
Yeah. So the citizenry in these countries has attributed economic success to their governments. But I guess the impact of a benign geopolitical climate has been underrated in the rise of these economies. And that benign geopolitical climate persisted till COVID pandemic. And it's only after that that we've seen it turn hostile. Initially slightly hostile, and now perhaps it's turning way more. Now, this is where I guess the troubles may begin for some of these countries, that they would either stagnate or find hard to replicate the growth rates of the past. Now, in those circumstances, how would their um, citizens react?
Mhm.
Whether they will be okay with as things are, or they would demand some changes,
Mhm.
or there could be some impulses for change of party or type of rule. Um, that
Change of
that's one.
party or even the type of government.
So that may come into play, and once that comes into play, we must remember that these have historically been very volatile polities, and they have a history of replacing or changing dynasties, governments, on a dime, basically. and and that risk is often heavily discounted by most of the Western observers, that the ability of the people in these regions to quickly change the government, the regime, whatever you may call it,
Mhm.
is quite significant, and they retain it till date.
Okay, so much so for East Asia. Let's move on to South Asia, where you sit,
Yeah.
or the Indian subcontinent, as some would call it. Um, what happens here?
See, the Indian subcontinent was already suffering in the post-pandemic
Mm.
era,
Yeah,
and growth rates had already moderated. Many countries have undergone political turmoil, notably Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Nepal.
and
Um,
Sri Lanka. After the Russia-Ukraine war,
Sri
you had a
Lanka,
whole mob. stormed the presidential palace. So
Yeah.
Sri Lanka arguably saw the most shocking
Colorful.
upheaval,
Yes.
the Buddhist country.
Yeah, but yeah, well, things happen. And so overall, this region has been an underperformer when it comes to the economy. So it wasn't anyway doing some great things,
Yeah.
but it has one thing in common. And
Hmm.
ironically, the giant in the Indian subcontinent, that is India, is also a party to it, which is basically heavy dependence on the remittance flow from the Gulf.
Yeah.
So you go to any Gulf country and you look at the labor force deployed, you would find Bangladeshis, you'd find Nepalese, you'll find Indians, you'll find Pakistanis, and you'll find Sri Lankans, and sometimes folks from Maldives too. So
I mean, look,
overall,
the Economist
mm,
had a chart, a graphic, which calculated which were the countries to most vulnerable to the Iran war, and which country is the biggest loser from the energy shock. And it was telling that, of course, they calculated as per their weightage and rankings. Jordan number one, Pakistan number two, Sri Lanka number three, Egypt number four. So, and of course, Ethiopia is also joined fourth, but and Kenya is sixth. So, in the top six, two are, of course, Middle Eastern countries, two are South Asians, and two are African. We'll get to Africa later, but the point is, this is very, very, very telling.
yeah, and in some ways, other than some of the dysfunctional nation states, this is the most vulnerable region to the fortunes of the Gulf. Should there be catastrophic changes in the Gulf economy, uh, the most proximate and direct impact would be on the South Asian economies, and we will definitely see some political turmoil associated with it. In particularly, the new governments in Nepal and Bangladesh will find it hard to deliver on their promises because the facts on ground have changed. And also in India, whereby people have become used to slightly highish rates of economic growth and a low inflation regime over the past 10 odd years, like, primarily on the basis of a very benign external geopolitical front. Now all of that is getting called into question, and the economy is facing its second major test after COVID pandemic. So the thing with COVID pandemic was that it played to India's strengths, that is science and technology and delivery of vaccines. That, I think, was a strong forte of India, and it could easily navigate that. But when it comes to resource architecture and the ability to pay for it through foreign exchange, that has historically been a weak point for the economy. In fact, the last major economic crisis, the balance of payment crisis that India suffered in 1991, was also on account of oil prices rising and deficiency of foreign exchange, sufficient
That
foreign
was
exchange,
because of the first Gulf War, partly.
first Gulf War and breakup of the Soviet
Soviet
Union.
Union, which hadn't happened, but the Soviet Union was in acute
Exactly, it was
crisis and
falling
couldn't
apart.
bail India out.
Yes, it was falling apart and it couldn't actually support
Yeah,
India's oil consumption
yeah.
and other critical energy and mineral needs. So we are seeing some similarities
Hmm.
with the past, although it's not as dire for now.
Hmm.
India is much more resilient and a stronger economy, but I suspect that some headwinds are to be expected given how profound this
Yeah.
crisis
But
is in the Gulf.
Manu, but you know my father. He's seen many a moon. He's seen a moon or two, and I spoke to him this morning, Washington D.C. time, evening in India, and he said that number one, clearly the government hadn't prepared the reserves that they claim are hugely underreported. Otherwise, we wouldn't have such shortages.
mm,
Number two, he said that there has been wage repression and wage suppression and capital repression. He said the middle class has been squeezed beyond belief by the current government, and any political party is guilty of it, because he said he used the word in Hindi revdi. Everyone
mm.
has the habit of to use an English term of handing out candies to the electorate, and the middle class funds that candy distribution. So he said the middle class doesn't have the capacity to sustain higher inflation. And third, he said that there will inevitably be job losses. And he's not an economist, by the way, he's a surgeon. But even
Mm.
he is deducing major economic pain for India, and in particular middle class Indians. Would you agree with his layman analysis of what's coming?
Largely, yes.
I see. I see. So, do you foresee a polycrisis for India and, by extension, the region as well in South Asia?
Yes, because it's a very vulnerable region,
Mm-hmm.
because it doesn't have its own energy resources, and secondly, it's not a prolific exporter, so it's hard pressed to earn foreign exchange,
Mm-hmm.
hard currencies,
So,
which makes
as
it
remittances go down and the oil bill goes up, so it is a double whammy.
it's a double whammy, and at the same time, the confidence of investors also goes down, and they start withdrawing their money. So
Mm-hmm.
that adds to another stream of
Mm-hmm.
capital outflow, which puts pressure on the foreign exchange, and that by implication, the exchange rate of of the currency, it begins to fall, free fall rather.
Free fall.
And
So
yeah,
basically, a currency crisis is certainly in the offing. You've been predicting the rupee would drop for a while.
yeah.
I've been even more negative and pessimistic than you. I expected the rupee to go well beyond 100 to a dollar, uh, and the currency crisis could lead to a balance of payments crisis as well, or we are not as vulnerable as 1991, and we might avoid that.
See, balance of payment crisis was a very unique moment in the
Indeed.
economic history, and it was generated again by a poly crisis of its own time, and
Mhm.
that was entirely external. Apart from the fact that India was running a very inefficient socialist setup that
Mhm.
basically rewarded um, rewarded protectionist industries that were making inferior goods, and at the same time it had these inefficient public sector enterprises that were bleeding money.
Mhm.
So overall a very inefficient economy that was
I mean,
unable
it's
to
still an
export.
inefficient economy, Manu.
I'll
It
come
is,
to that.
yeah.
I'll come to that. But two things have changed since
Mhm.
then. First is that India does have a presence outside of Gulf. So Indian
Mhm.
expatriates or immigrants are in other countries in a
Mhm.
pretty strong number.
Large
And
number, indeed.
yes, yeah, and they can help uh, India out as they did after the nuclear testing in 1998, and India was facing the American sanctions.
Indeed.
So Indians did subscribe to the India bonds, which were issued to boost the currency and the foreign exchange reserves. And the second aspect is the prolific services sector in India, which is export competitive, although it's come under some pressure in the recent times, but it still is the biggest export story out of India, and it has pretty deep and sticky client lines, which are expected to survive the AI winter. And so we are expecting that they would at least help offset and help India navigate through this crisis. Unlike 1991, when basically
Understood.
it didn't even have any useful export line.
Understood.
So
So that
yeah,
has changed. So we can avoid a balance of payments crisis, but India would be hard pressed to avoid what people are
yes,
calling
pressures would definitely be
a
very tough.
fuel.
Yes.
Let me just say what what a number of people are saying: a fuel, fertilizer, food, and foreign exchange crisis, combined with, of course, job losses, particularly amongst the middle class and falling incomes. So
Mm.
that is what India will experience, and Bangladesh and Pakistan and Sri Lanka might have greater vulnerabilities. So the region would be in trouble. We've already,
Which
yes, sir.
which actually brings into the play the specter of regional conflict. That
There's
these
already a war between Pakistan and Afghanistan. What's new?
Yes, yes, yeah, yeah. If other than the fact that that region has been at war like for I guess 20 out of the past 26 years, but
Yeah.
um,
We can go
but
back to 200, my dear friend, or
yeah,
300.
oh yeah, indeed,
We
indeed,
could go
indeed.
back. When has there been peace in that part of
that
the world?
that region has a very special history. It's a
Yeah.
crossroads of entire Asia in some ways. But importantly, I would say that Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, all of them have some or the other dispute pending with India,
Hmm.
and and it is in the times of crisis that that the fault lines
Hmm.
basically tend to
Sharpen.
sharpen, and it's around the fault lines that you see conflicts erupt.
Hmm.
So the chances of some kind of a conflict erupting are very high in the
It's
times of economic pressures
distress. Yeah.
than in the times when everything is hunky-dory and everybody's well fed and people have bread and cake on the table. That may not be the case now. So we can expect some sort of geopolitical um, conflicts rise or maybe get initiated during the upcoming months.
Okay. So we've talked about East Asia, Southeast Asia. We've talked about South Asia. We'll skip the Middle East because we covered it in some
Yeah.
detail. Let's move on to Africa, as I just mentioned in the Economist Index. The most vulnerable country, obviously, was a Middle Eastern one, Jordan, but Ethiopia and Kenya are there, and South Africa is not too far behind. And there has been a lot of talk amongst my African friends of the shortage of fuel and even more so of fertilizer really affecting that entire sub-Saharan region, especially that facing the Gulf. And of course, in the long term, many are predicting massive shift to solar power. As an African friend of mine said, that look, we don't know if we'll have the oil from the Gulf, but we know we'll always have the sun. So look into your crystal ball and tell us what do you expect in Africa. You've worked in Africa, so you're in a good position to talk about Africa.
Mm. So Africa is a very unique continent in that it has rich resources,
Hmm.
but it has extremely weak political structures.
Hmm.
And what happens during times of economic tensions is that you see a scramble for African resources. And most of the states over there become a victim of proxy play by bigger global powers. So, in the coming days, what we will see
You could
is
argue it's already happening in Sudan. You could argue that's already happening in Somaliland. I mean, Joseph Olmert said that it is MIT, which is not the nice MIT in Boston, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It is the Turkish intelligence agency. And
Turkish one.
yeah, and Joseph said on record that it is MIT versus Mossad all the way from Syria to Somaliland. So you could say that uh, has already begun or is in full play, whether it is Libya, whether it is Sudan, whether it is Somaliland. Um, the Russians Russian mercenaries have
Ye-
ousted French from
Yes,
Francophone
the
Afrique.
French.
So,
Yeah,
so we are seeing a lot going on.
yeah.
So this is already happening. What new will come off this conflict?
So big powers like Russia, China, US, obviously a bit of Turkey, Israel. I would even count um, the crown. I mean, as I call them, the crown countries, the UK, Australia,
The White
Canada, and
Commonwealth.
New Zealand. Yeah, I mean, see, with the Commonwealth, you have the recalcitrant members too, which are not exactly the crown prime ministers. So they have their own structures. They are republics, but within the Commonwealth, the crown territories, I guess, they would also have their own play. They have their own private military companies or corporations, as they call them,
Mhm.
and these PMCs are heavily active. And
The
one may ask,
Russians are there, not to forget them.
yep,
All
I
the,
named them the first. I said
yeah.
Russia and China the first. So the thing is that why are these guys there? They're there to secure resources.
Mhm.
So currently there's a smash and grab going on, which we've been talking about
Yeah.
for over a year now, that countries want to control resources because the existing market structures of
Mhm.
regulating access to resources are failing.
Mhm.
So when market structures fail, it's the guns that do the talking.
Mhm.
And now we are at that stage whereby the guns are doing the talking, whether it's the Gulf, whether it's Africa, or even the Russian Ukrainian
Mhm.
theater.
So,
Everywhere you see, everywhere you see the guns doing the talking because the market structures have fallen apart.
so Africa can expect more smash and
Intensification.
grab, more
Yes,
intensification of all the conflicts
yes.
continuing because of a resource grab.
In
Now,
fact, you may see hitherto unaffected countries also
hmm,
getting impacted, like Botswana, like South Africa,
Botswana is remarkably peaceful, at least so far.
is Namibia. I mean, nobody thinks that there would ever be anything over there, but I suspect that with the increasing global pressures, anything
Mm,
and everything would come into play. And most of these countries have very weak political structures, and they would always be susceptible to such power plays by bigger boys.
mhm. Now, so much so for Africa. Now let's move north across the Mediterranean into Europe,
Indeed,
which
nice beaches. Yes.
which finds itself in a bind after the Russia-Ukraine war. Europe decided to cut off Russian gas, and
Mm.
there's no more Nord Stream.
Well, this conflict has put
And now
what?
very quickly, they
Mhm.
find themselves cut off from Qatari gas, force majeure. And
Yeah,
I mean, is I wrote a big piece on the German economy a while ago,
yeah,
talked about the Mittelstand, amongst others. We have close friends in Germany, both you and I, especially I've spent a fair bit of time in Germany. And my friends in German business are nervous, to put it bluntly. My friends in Italy who are in manufacturing are nervous. North Italy is the other big manufacturing area in Europe. So, Manu, how do you see the European or the impacts on Europe or the European effects of the Iran war?
so when it comes to Europe, I think the bigger issue for them is the complete exhaustion, or I would say the the spending of political capital
Mm-hmm.
uh, of the global West for a conflict. So earlier on, what was there was that there's a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and the collective West was selling that as a cause to rest of the world. That look, this is a cause of liberty, of freedom, of rule of law, of international order. Now, suddenly you have another conflict, and this conflict seems to be far more impactful for rest of the world than the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Mhm.
And now you again have the same pitch being sold that Iran is basically running a pretty nasty, one may call, setup that fosters militias and proxies
Mhm.
across the regions, and it's not good for stability, rule of law, international order, and so on and so forth. It's trying to become a nuclear power, which would append the non-proliferation
So
setup.
Manu, I should stop you there and give you a counter. That is certainly the Irv narrative, which a lot of people are peddling. But to be fair, the most popular podcast in the UK is The Rest is Politics by Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart. And I sent you some clips of Rory. Rory has come out full guns blazing that this war is a violation of international law. It is illegal. There is
But
massive.
unfortunately,
Yes.
wait, unfortunately for poor Rory, um, the frame of debate has shifted. Now, he may be well intentioned, but the problem is
I
the
mean, he
rest of
is
the
well intentioned, even if
yeah,
I disagree with him on many
yeah.
things. He's certainly
But
a bright and well read and active fellow.
no, certainly a good egg. But
Yeah.
the problem is that uh, the rest of the world sees the West as a collective.
Yeah.
And it cannot be the case that suddenly a British broadcaster wakes up and says, "Oh, well, we are different. We have a different view, so just take it differently." No, people tend to see US, UK, and the rest as together. And the amount of political capital that can be spent on prosecuting a war is shared between the two. They may
Yeah.
not agree that it's shared, but for rest of the world, it is
It is.
shared.
Yes. I mean, that's the irony, right? Europe
Yes,
is not participating in the war. Spain has opposed the
yes,
war.
it has.
The irony is that European nations have said it's not our war. They haven't even sent minesweepers. They have
Correct.
rejected Donald Trump's appeals to
To
act
join.
militarily in opening the Strait of Hormuz. So the Europeans, to be fair, uh, are for once showing some spine. They have not jumped into battle alongside the Americans. And
Yep.
yet, what you're saying is they are tarred with the same brush because the world sees Europe and the US joined at the hip.
Yep. So, the rest of the world will say, okay, fine, we can accept that, maybe Russia is not the good party in this. Yes, you're right. Ukraine is fighting the good one, the good battle, and let's all pitch in for that. Let us sanction Russia. Then, you turn around and said, hey, no, Russia is okay. We found a bigger one.
A bigger villain.
Yes. And now the problem is that all of a sudden you have to arrange your policy architecture and everything just to fix or
Mm.
fit into whatever is the latest thinking in the Beltway or in London
By
or
the way,
in
the Beltway, for those of our
Brussels.
viewers who are not in America, is Washington, D.C. There's
Yeah,
a belt of highways that goes around Washington, D.C., and therefore inside the Beltway is often referred to the inside the echo chamber of Washington, D.C.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
In the spirit of full transparency, I used to once live in Washington D.C. So that's why I'm familiar with some of the
Terminology. But
terms.
yes, so,
Yeah.
but
But coming back, so the
Europe, what
political
happens to Europe?
capital.
Europe gets
Yeah.
tarred with the same brush, but Europe has suddenly
No,
no
here's the
energy.
problem.
Yeah.
Here's the problem that now the political backing for what Europe desires vis-a-vis Russia um, goes down drastically because people are busy with the Gulf now.
Hmm.
And in terms of priority, the European concerns vis-a-vis Russia are now firmly placed on the back burner. Number one. Number two is the whole problem of military logistics and supplies, which now get divided across two theaters. And arguably, in the Gulf theater, the consumption or one can call it destruction of military equipment, has been several magnitude higher
Mhm.
than was the case in the Ukrainian one, because um, some of the best equipment, for example, the terminal high altitude air defense, the THAAD, and its associated radars were deployed in various Gulf countries to monitor Iranian missile launches, and those were destroyed, successfully detected and destroyed by the Iranians. So the consumption of military equipment and logistics is being sharply diverted towards that front. And as a result, the Ukrainian front is getting denuded of whatever supplies that they could
Mm.
get from the American military industrial complex. Now, the European military industrial complex is there, but whether it can produce, that's, I would say, there are deep doubts about that whether they can really go toe to toe with the Russian one. In terms of quality, maybe yes, but in terms of quantity, definitely the Russians have an edge, and that leaves Europe, in a boat without a paddle and in a strong current. So pretty much they
But,
are not
but,
in
but Manu,
control.
I mean, you're talking about the geopolitics.
Mm.
Economically, I hear from my European friends that gas prices are going to, or lack of gas actually, is going to knock what remains of European industry in Germany and North Italy. Factory owners are really worried. They're also worried about inflationary effects. UK gilts have not been doing that well. I don't know if you've been following the Financial Times. The UK public finances are under pressure. There is specter of inflation and indeed stagflation in Europe. There is talk now in Germany of re-importing Russian gas. So forget about all these geopolitical trends which are very valid and very relevant. But economically, it seems Europe is in big trouble. Would you agree with what some of my European friends are diagnosing?
I would agree, and I will substantiate the point. See, um, the European industrialization happened on the back of colonial expansion. And what was essentially colonial expansion? It was
Mhm.
access to resources,
Indeed,
cheap resources,
indeed.
right?
I mean,
And then
very quickly,
system.
the reason the British ended up controlling Iran was because, and we cover it in our 90-minute podcast on Iran, Glenn and I, our colleague, our senior partner, Glenn and I, is because a certain Winston Churchill decided that Royal Navy ships would use oil, not coal. And that made Persian oil extremely critical for the UK. So much of the imperial expansion was a quest for resources. Over to you.
So now what we are seeing is that Europe is getting systematically cut off from cheap sources of energy. So first of all, it was the Russian gas.
Mm-hmm,
Now maybe the Qatari gas.
mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether the Americans will be willing to sell them at brotherly rates, as it's called, or as NATO ally rates, if they have those ones. So net,
Uh,
Europe is staring at being cut off from cheap energy sources,
mhm,
from cheap mineral sources,
mhm.
and because of its adverse geopolitical situation, it would also be hard pressed to exercise kinetic actions beyond its immediate neighborhood. So, for example, it would find it tough to participate in the resource warfare in Africa. It would find it
I
hard.
mean, the Russians have kicked the French out.
Yep.
And that is the
Yep.
big story of not just of this
And
year, a couple of years ago. The process began a few years
yes,
ago, and it has happened now.
and that would dictate the European financial and economic trajectory going into the future. Because if you cannot defend your territory, you cannot defend your currency. You cannot defend your currency, you'll be very hard put to manage your macros. So
They
people often
already
say,
have a debt crisis. The
exactly. So
French
people
couldn't
often
get a
say they have a
budget through.
crisis going on.
Yeah.
And I say, well, that crisis is the result of the policy choices exercised in the past 2 decades. They were busy. with pursuing other agendas which were quite divorced from the real politique of how the world runs. And I guess the results are showing up.
So the results, just to give one data point, UK borrowing costs reached highest level since 2008. And this is the Financial Times headline: UK borrowing costs reach highest level since 2008 as economic hit from war mounts. And so the European economies, aging economies with high debt burdens, were already in crisis. And now the war has spiked up inflationary pressures and, more importantly, their borrowing costs. So Europe seems to be in crisis as well. Maybe not a poly crisis like India or South Asia, but Europe certainly has a major crisis. Now let's close with the Americas. I suspect that Latin America will escape relatively scot free because they are resource rich. Correct me if I'm wrong. I
See, they
suspect
have two,
Canada should be fine. It has
no,
energy.
but
But,
they have two things going for them, which can be called a strength, but also a weakness at the same time.
Mhm,
According to the Donroe Doctrine, they fall in the zone that America will protect and guard rather fiercely, but also, I guess, it would seek some sort of control or leverage into the internal political affairs of these countries. But what that would mean is that these guys or these countries would be relatively stable and secure from any external aggression. At the same time, they are resource rich countries. The commodity cycle is supposed to undergo a boom now because
mhm,
some of the commodity producers will be offline. It looks
mhm,
like if this conflict
mhm.
persists. So
So good for
overall,
Venezuelan oil, huh?
yes, for I mean Brazil too. See, Brazil
Yeah,
too.
Brazil
Brazil is
too.
a significant exporter too, uh,
Exactly.
and and there are significant critical minerals in Argentina. The currency notwithstanding, I think that's a chronic problem. I don't see
Latin
them
America
ever.
and debt and currency crisis.
Yes,
What's new?
yeah. But other than that, they'll do
There was
well.
an Indian economist who said in the World Bank on
Mhm.
record once that the currency, the recurring inflationary and currency crises of Latin America were a genetic problem. It didn't go down very well.
Yeah, that's kind of very uneconomic to say, but generally economists hedge their words. But okay, fair enough. Um,
This is a while ago, by the way. This is
yeah,
not recent.
it's
I think he would be
not,
fired in 30 seconds today.
yeah. So and vis-a-vis like Canada and Mexico, they have a very special relationship with the US, and I think that special relationship would continue.
Mexico
Uh,
also has energy. Canada also has
yes,
energy. So it's
yes,
it's
yes.
not such bad news for them.
For the Americas, I
Yeah.
think the Western Hemisphere for that reason
Yeah.
would perhaps do better than rest of the world.
What happens to America? The 800-pound gorilla.
Well, there will be some wins, some losses out of this
Hmm.
conflict for them, depending upon how what the end state looks like. If they're able to fully prevail over Iran, then yes,
Hmm.
um, for the next few years, their position uh, as the lone superpower
Hmm.
is stable,
Hmm.
and the dollar would remain unchallenged
Hmm.
for a lot of uses, except for store of value, where there's
Hmm.
counterparty risk. I think that won't change now.
Hmm.
Um,
But
Other
as
than
a
that,
medium exchange, there'll be no challenge to the dollar
yes,
if
no
if
challenge
they
because
prevail.
if they prevail.
Hmm.
So that question remains, and what we're going to see in the medium term, if they indeed prevail, is a radical rearrangement of the
Hmm.
entire Gulf,
Hmm.
and enhanced investment and integration of the Gulf economies with the U.S. economy.
Hmm.
As of now, because they are diversified, they have a lot of stakes in Europe too. But I
Hmm.
would see that decline
Hmm.
if America decisively wins
Hmm.
this conflict. However, If this
What
ends in
happens
some,
if America fails? That is
yeah,
that is the
if
multi-billion-dollar question, trillion-dollar
yes,
question, actually.
if it ends up in some kind of a stalemate or a draw,
Mhm,
then the first challenge, I guess, to emerge would be on the currency front. That a lot of resource exporters, ex of the Americas, would like to hedge and denominate their exports in multiple currencies.
mhm,
Secondly, in the Gulf, we may see commodity exporters changing their relationship with
mhm,
America. We may see them leaning more towards China, leaning more towards, in some measure, also India and Russia.
mhm,
So, net net, it would be the upside, I would say, is status quo for America, that
mhm.
nothing much changes. But the downside is pretty significant if they fail to prevail.
So, Manu,
So,
it's very interesting you should say so, because some legendary investors in their 80s
mm,
have said that if America cannot control the Strait of Hormuz, can it operate in the Taiwan Strait? And following on from that, they've said that the Iran war could be America's Suez. So basically, 2026 could be a repeat of 1956.
six.
So that is amongst the older investors with long memories,
Yeah.
certainly a scenario,
No,
if
that
not a
is a
prediction.
scenario. That is a scenario because it's the case with almost all empires and great powers um, that they tend to overspend, stretch themselves thin.
Imperial overstretch, Paul Kennedy,
Yeah. And then
from our
later on,
reading lists in university.
indeed, indeed. And then finally they get into a conflict that they think would be a cakewalk, but it doesn't turn out to be so. Whether that is the case with this one, it's an open question yet. But the fact that the Iranian government has managed to survive for so long against the full might of
Mhm,
combined US Israeli and military strength is something that was unbelievable even 5 years ago. Like the understanding was that, yeah, maybe a week max, but that would be it.
mhm.
The fact that there are some kind of talks about talks and whether or not they work out or that there could be some sort of some hope of a negotiated settlement, that in itself is a huge signal. Now let us see where this goes. It may all be a bluff, and next weekend we may see
Yeah,
uh, you know,
but as a
big.
young investor has
Mm,
pointed out, a really young investor, mid 20s, quite a brilliant chap,
mm,
he said only two things matter: bond yields and Strait of Hormuz.
yeah,
If American
yeah,
bond yields climb and if America cannot control the Strait of
yeah,
Hormuz, then we are
yeah.
definitely looking at America's Suez.
Bond markets are the biggest, decision influencer in the world for any president or prime minister.
And
So
always have been. Ultimately,
always have been.
part of the reason, and we'll end with this: the UK won over, prevailed over France, won the Franco or the Anglo-French battle for global domination. Was although the French had Napoleon, and of course the British had Nelson and yada yada, the British could issue bonds and raise money in markets, and
Yep.
that meant that the British were bound to prevail. And 1815, Waterloo, was inevitable. On that merry note, ladies and gentlemen, it's been great to have you. Manu Sharma, thank you very much for your time. Make
Pleasure.
sure make sure those of you who are listening to us, watching us, subscribe to our YouTube channel, press the bell icon, sign up for our newsletter, follow us on LinkedIn. Those of you who are CEOs and investors, reach out to FOI. Manu Sharma is the partner. I am a partner, and Sanjay Acharya is the managing partner. And those of you who want to make sense of the world, read Fair Observer. We do not have paywalls. We have perspectives from around the world, both Iranian and Israeli, both Republican and Democrat. Views all the way from Japan to Brazil. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Bye for now.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.